So I think I'll pick up a few themes that you've heard about already this afternoon. The first one, probably from Michael himself, is that as those of us go around looking for funding of these different ventures, whether for-profit or non-profit, it does seem to accelerate the aging process itself. So what I thought I'd do is whirlwind tour through sort of different types of funding models and sources and pick up a few themes that you've heard from Brian and Deborah already. First of all, as we're looking at bringing science out of the lab and into the clinic, it goes through different stages. One of the things to think about is sort of who invests when and what types of capital is available to, what type of capital is available to whom at what time. So you see in this chart, for example, that venture capital plays a significant role, if not half the pie, in preclinical and phase 1, but then fades away to be replaced by private equity sources. You see large pharma sort of goes in and out. You see, for example, institutional hedge funds play different roles at different stages. You see angels play a role early on and then go away where the dollars get really big. So as we think about what's it take to bring any of this science to the market at any particular time, we need to think about who has the resources, what are the types of people, and how do we plan for the next type of person coming along. But before we even get to that point, we have our friends at the NIH, and Brian has already talked about them. Here's a slightly different view of it. One view that shows the problem that we all have, and namely, if you look at what's happening in real dollars from the NIH, forget just the National Institute of Aging itself, just NIH in aggregate, we're losing real money real fast. And so here you see inflation-adjusted dollars in terms of appropriation from 2003 to 15. Here you see a recommendation that the Federation of American Society of Biology did. Here is an increase that was approved in 2016. But basically, see, even if they do this recommendation, it's not bringing us back to where we were a decade ago. So now that you're depressed, what do we do next? Well, that's where the Buck Institute comes in its way, or the Harvard Stem Cell Institute comes in its way, and we're sort of a different business model on the same theme. So the Buck Institute is a standalone organization, but the Harvard Stem Cell Institute was formed deliberately to say, wait a minute, do we need to form a standalone institution? Can we, in fact, connect dots across multiple institutions, all of which have a Harvard affiliation? So it's really a virtual research institute that spans the schools of Harvard and the 10 Harvard-affiliated hospitals. It should be noted, just out of curiosity, that each of those hospitals is an independent entity itself. They're all affiliated with Harvard and the medical school. So within that organization, we take a stem cell view of the world to both understand disease and conditions and see what we can do about them. So we have several hundred faculty crossing departments, crossing institution, all with a sort of stem cell hat on. The way we're organized is through an executive committee of a dozen senior scientists. One of our advisors from the business school likes to refer to us as intellectual venture capitalists, because we don't have that much money to spend, but we can talk about projects forever. No, just kidding. Wrong thing. And we put the money to work in three basic categories. One is very early stage science, these seed grants, with the hope that some of those will actually then go on to generate data, have a breakthrough that can go on and get NIH funding, despite the grim pay lines you saw before. We have some core platforms that say any one lab won't build on its own, like an IPS core facility, a cell-based screening facility, that sort of thing, that can accelerate the research across that network. And then we organize interdisciplinary programs across labs in half a dozen disease categories that you see there. But that's only done if we have money to do that. And we're building, where we spend our work trying to raise money is in the philanthropy and sponsored research area. The government and other, we leave up to the departments and the labs. So getting NIH money, yeah, will help people write program grants, that sort of thing. But the faculty in the labs and departments are up to this. This is their role in life. our role is say, how do we get philanthropy to build on top of this platform? And then how do we partner with research, with disease foundations, with whether it's Cure Duchenne, and I'll give an example of another foundation later, or with companies to leverage our money even further. So a recent example that you may have seen in the press was with Boehringer Ingelheim. We just announced a 3-year project across several different labs to study the problem of fibrosis, which is not, it's aging related. It's not aging specific, but it's definitely aging related. We're looking at fibrosis in lung, liver, and kidney in this example and hoping to grow it further. And this is really a joint research project. So it's this type of, by having the base of scientists working in different organisms, studying this problem, we could then partner with a pharmaceutical company to do early stage research, and then we'll see where that goes. And one way, again, to think about fibrosis is really maladaptive repair. And it's interesting, when we first formed this group, one of the person who's leading the lung work said, this is great, I only talk to the lung guys all the time. And they're already comparing notes with some of the work in the liver and looking at potential joint solutions. One of the other things we try to do, a reason for forming the Institute, was saying, look, just writing grants, publishing the next Science, Nature, Cell, et cetera paper, although we do want people to do that, and it's one of the metrics, is to say, we want to have an impact on disease. We want to have an impact on the market. We want to get things out of the lab and into the clinic. So to Mike's point, we're saying, look, how do we actually play a role in connecting academia to the commercial sector, to investors, and move stuff down that pipeline? And we'll talk about a couple ways that we do that. So one of the things this has resulted over the last few years is a few different startup companies coming out of Harvard, out of HSCI faculty. These are not necessarily, quote, regenerative medicine companies, but they're coming out as they sort of have a stem cell-based sort of science behind them. Now, unlike either Deborah or Brian, we're not a separate entity. We're not a separate 501c3. So we ourselves don't own equity in this. So either Harvard or the hospitals do, or the PIs, and then obviously the investors. You can see different types of companies here. But one of the things that's important to think about is, for those of you who have an entrepreneurial flair and want to commercialize either your science or someone else's, is to think about who are the right people and partners to do that. So for example, because I'll talk about venture capital in a moment, many of these companies have significant venture capital behind them. But for example here, one is Q-State Biosciences at the bottom of this list, which was deliberately where the founders and original investors are deliberately avoiding venture capitalists. They got some angel money, and they're funding it so far through sponsored research and other non-dilutive funding, and are trying to grow the company that way, and are specifically not talking to those wonderful venture people that everyone else is chasing down. That said, we still like them because they do fund a lot of our work, and we need them. And why do we need them? Well, I thought I'd share some data from the recent report on healthcare venture capital that the Silicon Valley Bank just put out in the first 6 months of this year. And to say, are things going well or not? Because we all know the public markets, particularly in the biotech world, got whacked over the head this past year. But the venture capital world still continues, and here are their summary points, which basically says, money's coming in, big exits are happening, things are healthy. But let's take a look and see if that's really true. So here, as a little bit of a breakdown in that, they look at, in healthcare, they're looking at biopharma, they're looking at devices, they're looking at diagnostics. And what's interesting, and here's 2016, that this is just the first half, so you can multiply by 2, and you say, okay, wait a minute, good money is coming into the biopharma segment. Good money is coming into devices. In fact, it's growing compared to what's happened last year. And the same is true in diagnostics. On the other hand, what's interesting is if you look at, for example, this point down here, the company Grail, which many of you may have heard about, was responsible for half the dollars. So there are many companies in here, but one of them raised half the money. So one of the questions will become, what's happening to the pie? Here's another way of looking at the pie, namely if you look at 2015 through the first half of 2016, a big chunk of it goes into cancer. So yes, immunotherapy, CAR T, all that sort of stuff got really exciting, really great clinical results. Everyone piles into the business. So as those of us are looking at companies in other domain areas, one of the things that is important as you think about talking to investors is, well, they may all be thinking about the next big oncology deal, and even though my idea makes tons of sense, I may not get much time and attention if I'm not in the right place at the right time. On the other hand, we can see what we can do about it. The other thing that's happening is the deal sizes are increasing, which may or may not make sense. But if you look at this, this means you need a lot of money to play. And so here, if you say the median deal size has tripled since 2013, going from, in this case, 15 million to 42, which is huge. Big exit multiples are continuing to happen. One of the things that's also interesting is the relationship between when those exits happen, whether it's at a commercial phase, as was happening, say, back in 2012, when, say, almost half of exits happen at a commercial stage, where here in 2015, for example, half of them happen in phase 2, and the other half, a mixture of even preclinical and phase 1. And so one of the other things that happen is when can you, if you're looking at whether you're a foundation trying to capitalize on the investments that Deborah was talking about, or whether you're an entrepreneur trying to bring your company to the next stage of growth, one of the things is what's happening in that mix. And one of the things that's also happening in terms of the exits will also be driven as a difference between the IPO markets and the M&A markets. And one of the things that's interesting so far is that in 2016, despite the public markets, the first half IPOs are still okay. They're not as good as last year, obviously, but they're anticipating that M&A exits will more than make up for that. Whether that continues to be true or not is another question. At a more global level, so that was in the healthcare venture world, and the more global level, here's a summary that Michael Greeley, who runs Flare Capital in Boston, which does focus in digital health primarily, and he was looking at venture money in general and what had happened over the last year. And a major point here, there are a couple major points. He said the top 10 funds raised 62% of all dollars. And then, top 5 raised $4 billion or 45% of the total. In short, less than 10% of the funds raised about half the capital. So you basically have a handful of very few funds with a lot of money. 2 funds of over $1 billion, blah, blah, blah. And then down here, at the other end of the spectrum, 7% was raised by first-time managers with an average fund size of $34 million. So it shows that there's a very unequal distribution of investment money. And one of the problems with the big funds, the billion-dollar fund, they can't worry about small deals. You heard Michael talk earlier about a $5 million fund that can help start some very early-stage risky companies. Well, the billion-dollar guys can't afford to do that. They have to put a lot of money to work all at once and hope to get that return back within the lifetime of their fund, which then drives behavior. I had a couple slides here. Unfortunately, the links didn't pass through, so I'll pass through those, and then say, well, that then gives opportunities for organizations like Deborah, or for example, the SMA Foundation that I'll share an example about, to play a different role and say, okay, if, for example, for the small markets, if for the early stage, for the orphan diseases, there isn't that capital available, what other vehicles do we have to make a difference? So this is where disease foundations have made a huge difference, I think, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years. Spinal muscular atrophy is a childhood genetic disease, varies in severity. There's sort of 3 or 4 levels depending how you look at it. The least severe level, you can live in a wheelchair for quite a long time. Most severe level, you die within a few years, childhood onset. It's effect of too low levels of this protein, survival of motor neuron protein, that's ubiquitously expressed, i.e. it's expressed in all cell types, but if it's underexpressed, if you have low levels of it, it selectively kills motor neurons, and we don't know why. So before the SMA Foundation was established, and again, it was established by a couple of parents who had a daughter with SMA. Unlike some other foundations, they had the advantage of having their own money that they could invest in the foundation, so they didn't have to fundraise. But in general, not much was happening in the disease. And here, I won't bother reading you that list. Here's a graphic view of it. If you look at drug development programs back in 2003, there was one drug development program happening. So what the foundation did is say, how can we act as a catalyst and organize multiple types of resources, multiple types of issues to address this problem, so that you don't have just one person, one entity working on something, and because we all know the chances of that succeeding by portfolio theory are very low. So they fund basic research, they work with patients, they work with regulatory agencies, et cetera. And they were working at all levels, from the basic all the way into the clinic. And they've spent their money over, and these data are about a year old, but up through 2015, they had this $110 million portfolio that spent money in these different areas, in drug discovery, clinical research, basic, specific mouse models that they made available to people when they run for compound testing, looking for biomarkers. How can you get both predictors of disease as well as predictors of outcomes of research? So working across multiple categories with multiple groups, both academics and companies. And as a result, in 2015, the situation looks very different and looked very different. So now there are many companies, many academic, taking many different approaches, whether in some cases it's stem cell based, some cases it's gene therapy, it's exon skipping, there are a whole variety of approaches, much like what Deborah described in Duchenne's. So this shows the effect that a foundation can have by connecting dots across resource and putting money and trying to address these sort of problems. But there are other ways to do that too. So for example, a couple weeks ago, you may have seen an announcement by the NIH and the Welcome Trust where they're sponsoring essentially a competition, a prize. They're collaborating across geographies, so to get over the problem of it not being done in Europe as well as here. But saying how can the NIH and the Welcome Trust collaborate together to essentially run a competition to encourage more collaborative research and create more innovative approaches. So government agencies and nonprofits saying how do we actually stimulate early ideas better. Or another version is the MRC technology, so the Medical Research Council in the UK, that had set up a separate tech transfer charity, the MRC technology, and is now opening a center in conjunction over in China in order to advance early discoveries. So it's a foundation that then set up a sub-foundation in order to specifically to focus on getting work out of the clinic and into the market, and doing it across geography, saying we can't just do this in the UK. We, in fact, have to really partner with parties from around the world. But at the same time as we think about money going in, we also have to think, what does it take to get products out and into the market? And that raises two questions that I'll just touch on super briefly, namely regulation and reimbursement. One of the things you may have seen recently, and this was published a couple weeks ago, was the final report from the European Medicines Agency on this adaptive pathways pilot. So this adaptive pathways has been an idea particularly in diseases of high unmet medical need, small patient populations, where you can't do huge trials, say, how do we design a trial and then sort of adapt it in real time as we go forward? And they ran a relatively large-scale pilot. The results were successful. They're going to do more of it going forward. And there are a couple of interesting things. So the goal was accelerate access to drugs for patients with most pressing medical needs, blah, blah, blah. How do you have iterative development? How do you get all the right health technology authorities across all the countries in Europe? They did all that hard work. And several regenerative medicine companies were part of this. Bluebird Bio, Immunocore with their melanometry, and Pluristem with their cell therapy product, out of a handful of other companies as well. So this is an exciting development. On the other hand, people have been talking about adaptive trials for a long time, and they're fine, but there seemed to be good traction. But here, notice that the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Companies said the challenges to doing this are clear. These include data are not always generated, therefore not comparable. E-health systems are not always comparable. Patients not having a single electronic health record, blah, blah, blah. So even then, how do we know what we're measuring, how we're measuring, and how we're managing is going to be a key issue, even if these adaptive trials can be well managed and well structured. But that's one of the things for us, I think, to think about as a field, that as we're looking at bringing these sort of solutions to market, are there creative regulatory schemes, such as adaptive pathways that you can use? But then if you do that, how do you manage it so that they can actually be successful? Touch briefly on reimbursement. One of the things we also need to think about is how do we get clever about reimbursement, particularly for curative therapies, particularly if you think of how we're holding off the effects of things like aging. And so, for example, there was a recent paper, 6 months ago, published by Andrew Lowe at MIT, who is in the financial engineering department. It's MIT, they call it all engineering. It's the financial engineering department at MIT. Where he basically came up with a notion of healthcare loans and then syndicating healthcare loans. Because in our field, particularly the stem cell regenerative medicine, aging field, people talk about, well, how do you pay for a curative therapy? For example, the big gene therapy example, Glybera, had a list price of $1 million that, used it once. GSK a couple weeks ago just published that their gene therapy product for ADA SCID would have a price at $600,000, would actually have a cash back guarantee if it doesn't have clinical outcomes. So outcome-based payment. So Andrew Lowe was taking the idea of the step forward, that basically saying, how can you create a vehicle like a home loan, like a student loan, like a car loan, where you can have a vehicle, and that basically patients can take out a loan for their therapy and then pay it back over time, and you can have different investors and you model the cash flows and all that good sort of stuff. So basically coming up with a creative financial solution to say, how can we enable these sorts of solutions to come to the market that otherwise would be very expensive, no one will be able to afford, and everyone gets caught in an argument about what the hell do we do about it. He admits there are lots of problems. Those of you who want to read the article, here are the problems. He's very upfront about it. He has answers to those problems, but nonetheless. But Andrew ended that article with a quote that I'll leave with you today, namely, considering the large burden of disease, and he has hepatitis as his example here, and the many transformative therapies on the horizon, developing more efficient financing methods is now a matter of life and death. Taking action is no longer a choice, but has become a necessity. And I think that's true for not only the financing part, but also for the science part. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.